Hello, and welcome to Perspectives on Faith on Ebru TV. I'm your host, Dr. Amir Hussain. With me today is my guest, Dr. Bruce Lawrence. Professor Lawrence is the Nancy and Jeffrey Marcus Professor of Humanities at Duke University, Professor of Islamic Studies at Duke University, and the Director of the Duke Islamic Studies Center. Welcome, Professor Lawrence.
Thank you, Amir. Good to be here with you.
Wonderful to be here with you. Could you tell us a little bit about your background? You are one of the most senior, one of the most distinguished scholars of Islam in North America, and you've been doing this for a lot longer than most people have been interested in Islam in North America. Can you tell us a little bit about how you got interested in studying Islam?
Well, actually, it's about half a century now. When I was 16, I took my first Arabic course, and it was actually a mistake. I wanted to do Chinese, and there was a schedule conflict, so a friend of mine said, let's try this other language. And I said, what is it? And he said, Arabic. I said, Arabic? Sounds strange, but let's go. So it's been 50 years on doing Arabic, and first it was philosophy. Had a wonderful undergraduate teacher who got me inspired to think about philosophy and to recognize that there were major names in Islamic philosophy. I think I studied Ibn Sina before I studied Aristotle, but it was fun doing both. And from there it was literature, and from there history, and then I got out of school, actually did Turkish, believe it or not, for 2 years, did Turkish, and thought, well, maybe I'll become an Ottoman historian. And then I realized that's really tough. That's even tougher than just doing Arabic and thinking about philosophy. So I took time out, went to the Navy, then went and did my MDiv up in Cambridge at Harvard. And then I decided, I really wanted to do Arabic, and got into the program at Yale, worked with Professor Rosenthal, Franz Rosenthal, best known for translating the Muqaddimah from Arabic to English. And then I got lucky again and got a job at Duke, my first job, and I've been there for 37 years.
Mm-hmm. It's a wonderful place to be, and you've created this wonderful Islamic Studies Center there. Can you tell us a little bit about the program there and the things that you do?
Sure. When I was hired at Duke, not to teach Islam, but to teach what's called Asian religions, as you know, from Harvard. And so the idea is, if you know one, you know all. If you know about Islam, you know Buddhism, Hinduism, toss in Sikhism, Jainism. You're an all-purpose infield player when it comes to Asia, and you can do any religion. But gradually, as my research developed, Amir, I became more and more interested in thinking about Islam and thinking about Islam and contemporary movements. My website now has as its sort of entry logo, defrocked medievalist, Abrahamic pluralist. Mm-hmm. And actually, until the Iranian Revolution of '79, I thought the world had ended or should have ended in 1500. All the great stuff I studied, all the wonderful scholars from the Islamic past, except for maybe Suyuti, had lived before 1500. But then the Iranian Revolution happened, and because I'd also learned Persian, there was an emphasis on thinking about contemporary Islam. And so if there's one good thing that came out of Khomeini, it pushed me into the modern world, or at least the modern period, and thinking about Islam. So that shifted towards Muslim social movements. And I still kept this seed in the back of my mind that I really liked the pre-modern period and liked the classical sources, and above all the Quran. And so luckily for me, it's back about 5 years ago, it was 2002, I was contacted by a British publisher who said, would you write a book on the Quran? I said, no. He said, why not? I said, listen, I'm not an expert on the Quran. I said, I use it, I love it, I learn from it, but I'm not an expert.
That's not your training.
I'm not my training. Right. I'm not a scriptural exegete. Tafsir has not been my field of study. It's been tarikh, history, or tasawwuf. As you know, I've done a lot of work on institutional Sufism. But he kept pushing me, and I said, well, why? Why do you want me, of all people, to write a book on the Quran? He said, well, because Michael Sells has done a great job for people who want the literary stuff, but we want people who never have heard of the Quran, perhaps have a completely erroneous notion of Islam, and you have to be able to write a book without footnotes. Oh, I said, that's very hard. For a scholar to write without footnotes is like trying to write without ink. I mean, how do you do it? Mm-hmm. But anyway, I accepted that challenge. Oh, and also without adverbs. Adverbs? I thought they were very important. But anyway, I wrote a sample chapter. First time I'd ever done this, 5 years ago. I'm now 66, so I'd already turned 60. And for the first time in my life, I wrote a book that was quote unquote, not for academics, for a popular audience, in quote unquote simple English, and I found it extraordinarily liberating. And so I got the contract, I did 1 chapter, I did 15 chapters, I revised it multiple times, and it came out in this series called The Quran, a Biography, which was not my title. I wanted to call this book, I wanted to call it The Book of Signs Over Time. But the whole series is called Books That Changed the World, and every one is a biography. So for instance, Karen Armstrong is doing the Bible. Hers is called The Bible, a Biography. Those are the only 2 scriptures. They didn't do the Mahabharata, they didn't do any Buddhist Pitakas or sutras. They did instead just these 2, the Quran and the Bible. And then, Marx Das Kapital, Darwin's Evolution of Species. All these are major books. Adam Smith, Wealth of Nations.
Or the important books that changed
Only important
history.
books that changed the world, and the Quran was defined as one. But that meant in writing this book, instead of doing tafsir, which I'm not qualified to do and would have resisted and probably declined to do, I had the opportunity to think about how the Quran itself has been interpreted over the ages from different places. And I must say, 2 parts of that book really educated me in a way I never had thought about the Quran before. One is I went back and tried to recall where I had first felt the awe, not just about the language and use of the Quran, but about its public display.
Okay.
And I realized that the first place was back in 1966 when I went to Jerusalem for the first time and went to the Dome of the Rock, and I looked up and I said, oh, that's familiar. Oh, that's the Quran. And I suddenly found myself reading the Quran in this space, and it's magical. I mean, it's extraordinary. The book itself is extraordinary, but to see it in those columns and those border definitions in the Qubbat al-Sakha, in the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem and Haram al-Sharif, really impressed me. So 1 chapter in my book about the Quran biography is the Dome of the Rock and why those Quranic inscriptions and what do they mean. And as you know, the other part of my life has been spent in the subcontinent in South Asia. And again, when I thought about the Quran, not as a book, but as an artifact almost, as a part of history that has shaped different places and defined them, I said the other place that's been defined by the Quran, not as a book, but as iconic calligraphy, is the Taj Mahal. And when I told the publisher I was going to do a chapter of the Taj Mahal, I said, but I thought that was Hindu. I said, no. It's not only Muslim, but it has actually verses from the Quran that are picked for a specific reason. And I think it's important to sort of show that what everyone thinks is one of the wonders of the world, the Taj Mahal, is also a wonder for exemplifying the message of the Quran.
A deeply Islamic building, and that's one of the things I think is so misunderstood by people, that we tend not to look at the artistic heritage of Muslims and just the 2 buildings you named. The Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem is sort of the iconic image of Jerusalem. Everyone on their list of the 10 most important or most beautiful buildings in the world puts the Taj Mahal, which is a Muslim building, a mausoleum. And I think that's so important to say that Muslims have contributed in tremendous ways, and we can talk about this as well, to the arts, and I know your work in that area. But tell me a little bit more about writing a book for a popular audience, because I think that's so interesting that here you are as one of the foremost scholars of Islam in North America and a very distinguished scholarly career, and now you're being asked to write a book for a popular audience. Do you think that talks about the need to help non-Muslims or even Muslims who aren't trained in the scholarly traditions to learn more about Islam? How to make the Quran explainable or explicable to either non-Muslims or Muslims who don't have that scholarly training in understanding the Quran?
Well, it's such a great question, Amir, because those 2 groups, non-Muslims and Muslims who aren't trained in academic study of Islam, define most of my students. In other words, when I teach a class at Duke and I teach a large class on Islamic civilization, 50, 55 students, I would say all but maybe a half dozen of them are non-Muslims. And the Muslim students in the class are largely engineers or science-oriented or pre-med students for whom, obviously they're familiar with the Quran. Most of them, not all of them, but most of them are devout Muslims, so they're also familiar with at least the Surah Al-Fatiha through prayer. But they've never thought about it, and they never thought about what it means. In fact, some of the ones who are South Asian Muslims It's just sort of, it's a rote memory, and the notion that there's a sort of deeper trough of history that they might explore just has never come up for their consideration. So yesterday, I was here early because I was invited by a group from Harvard Divinity School to talk to them about my book, because they've used it, and I said, at what level? And they said, high school. I said, high school? This is the level when I believe many students are shaped. Primary school obviously is very important,
Sure.
and you can't gainsay the necessity of reaching students from kindergarten through 8th grade. But by the time they get to high school, students begin to think about what they want to do and how, especially, they conceive of projects and how they express themselves in writing or on the internet, or now by Facebook. So you have to somehow get to students at that level with something important and positive about Islam, or else the heavy sludge of media sort of makes it more difficult for them to appreciate the breadth and also the aesthetical dimension of Islam. So I went to this group, and it was supposed to be about an hour and a half, and it wound up being 3 hours.
And so these were high school teachers?
All high school teachers. Some of them taught in private schools, some of them taught in charter schools, some of them taught in public schools. 3 of them taught in Catholic schools. This would be interesting to you. So I said, how do you teach about Islam in Catholic schools? They said, well, we have to say it once, say it twice, say it 3 times. There is no Pope in Islam. And they said, it's really strange for these to imagine a religion without a Pope. So I said, how did they feel when King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia visited the Vatican? They said, actually, they were very confused. And I said, well, I was too, until I read about it in Arabic. Because I was in Saudi Arabia last week when this, it happened just Wednesday, it happened 10 days ago. Right. The King Abdullah, first ever Saudi monarch visiting
to go to the Vatican.
The Vatican. And so in the English papers, it's all about, this is a great opportunity for interfaith dialogue and cooperation moving forward. In the Arabic newspapers, there's a little bit more guarded. They said, well, it's actually just 2 monarchs talking. And I thought, monarchs? And then it went on to say, of course, the Pope has a religious title, but he actually has as well a territory.
Sure, the Holy See is small, but it's a territory. He's a religious.
So what you've got is you've got 2 monarchs talking to you, this Catholic monarch and this Muslim monarch. I thought it was just such a lovely image of, saying, okay, it is possible to talk across cultures. But most people don't laugh, and they don't look very deeply when it comes to Islam. They think of the Quran as, first of all, a closed book because it's Arabic, and because, of course, in Islamic theology, the notion is that it cannot be understood unless it's recited, that the real importance of the Quran is the spoken, not the written or read Quran. And if you don't know Arabic, you hear sounds without meaning or with a very opaque sense of their meaning. So how do you go from that level of very deep spiritual connection to the Quran to then trying to make it understandable to people who aren't Muslims, or Muslims who have very little sense of their own religious background? So one of the things that I did with these people yesterday is I said, okay, first of all, I want you to just be honest. When I mention the word Islam, what's the first thing that comes to mind? And they all said Arab. I said, well, that's where you have to start thinking. First of all, there are Turkish people who are not Arabs. One of the students said, but they're kind of like Arabs. I said, I don't think that would really be well understood or appreciated among my Turkish friends. Then there are Iranians. Well, they definitely are Arabs. No, I don't think they're quite Arabs.
Their language is a little bit different.
Farsi is close, and there's a guy who said he wrote the Quran in Persian, but it's not quite the same. And then I said there's Asia. And so I talked about India, Pakistan, Bangladesh. And then I said Indonesia, and they said, oh, but Indonesian, they're mostly, aren't they mostly Chinese? I said, no, actually, they're quite different. There's a Chinese minority, but most of the Indonesians are from a different ethnic background. They're Bahasa Malay, and they're Muslim.
And it's the largest Muslim population in the world.
And then you say it's the largest Muslim country in the world. They say, but, how then do they relate to the Quran? And I said, well, there's a story. And then we talked about the fact that actually one chapter in my book is about the Quran and how it's used in Indonesia. And they were just astonished. They said, my gosh, this must really have many, many levels of influence on the Muslim world for it to be used from the Arabic, and I talk about the Arabic and the classical people like Tabari and his impact, and Jafar as-Sadiq for Shiites, and then of course some of the classic Mufassirun and the modernists like Ahmad Khan and Muhammad Iqbal. But then at one point I do say, and yeah, the Sufi healer in Indonesia uses verses from the Quran to heal people. And they said, but they don't understand it. I said, that's the other thing that is very, very important to know, is if you regard this work as revealed, you are not necessarily required to understand it to be affected by it. And so the people looked at me and said, oh, you mean it's miraculous? I said, let's just say there are deep connections.
Absolutely.
And that's what I spent much of my time talking about, is how, if you accept or submit, and I talked about the general sense of Islam, I often do this also back at school, that people say, well, we're not Muslims. I say, well, actually, and this you're going to remember from Wilfred Cantwell Smith, most of the world is not Muslim with a capital M, but all humankind is Muslim with a small m. So that somebody who submits to a higher authority is a Muslim with a small m.
Literal meaning.
That's a literal meaning of surrender, submitting, recognize that you're not the center of the universe. There is another center beyond you and defining you. So I found that to be really helpful in my meeting with these high school teachers. And they asked me one question that was really, really hard. They said, how can we communicate the feeling of Arabic without knowing it? I said, well, it's really hard. I said, let me just give you one phrase. And we sort of did an exercise. And nobody in the room except me knew Arabic.
Speak Arabic, yeah.
So I said, you have to do the basmala. What's the basmala? I explained what basmala is. And I explained the importance of it and how often it's said and the significance of the basmala. And did the whole thing of saying it's, starts 113, there are 114 chapters. It starts all except Surah Tawbah, and explained a little bit why that's different. So if you know the basmala, the bismillah, you at least know something about Islam. But then I said it's much better to know Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Well, they said, that sounds pretty nice. I said, well, it's because there's a subtle rhyme, Rahman and Rahim. And then explain to them that Arabic has triliteral stems. There's the Ra, the Ha, and the Mim. And the Rahma really means womb. They were astonished. He said, how can God have a womb? Well, first of all, God doesn't have features. But I said, if you have to think of affects, just imagine that you do know Arabic, or you have some sensibility of Arabic, and you hear Bismillah, which means God, the beyond. If you want to translate in any language, say it's the beyond. And the beyond is above all defined by inclusiveness in the way in which the particular anatomical feature of a woman is a womb that includes everything within it.
It shelters the child.
Shelters the child, nurtures it, and provides it with life. And then, of course, the question comes, why two? Why don't you just have Bismillah ar-Rahman or Bismillah ar-Rahim? Why is it Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim? That's tougher. But I try to give them Tabari. And Tabari's answer in this is, Rahman in Arabic, Fa'alan is just the form of possession. It's the basic definition of one's character, whereas Rahim is always directive and giving. So Rahman means, in my translation, full of compassion, and Rahim is always compassionate. So compassion means like the Buddha. I've got it, I give it.
Right.
This is I've got it, this is I give it. And actually some of them were Buddhists, so they liked that a lot. They said, so it's really dual. I said, it's not dual in character, it's dual in function. And so we had a lovely discussion, and I think they're going to remember the basmala.
That's wonderful. And one of the things I really appreciate about the book, to use language from our colleague, Jane McAuliffe, when she gave the presidential address to the American Academy of Religion in 2004, called Reading the Quran with Fidelity and Freedom, she talked about the experienced Quran. And I think that's crucial, which is what your book, The Quran, a biography, really brings out. That Muslims experience the Quran. It's not just simply a text that we read, even though we read it, or a text that we memorize, even though some of us memorize it, but a text that we see in architecture, in the big things, a text that we see in calligraphy, a text that we hear, and that becomes so important, the experienced Quran.
Yeah, I actually love it. I think that what happens in religion, as you know, perhaps even better than I from your experience with students at a Catholic institution, is that too much of religion takes place between the ears and not enough takes place from the heart. Or, in this language of philosophy, there's too much cognitive learning and there's not enough affective learning. And I think to appreciate the Quran, yes, of course, it has marvelous literary attributes that could be and should be extolled and examined and developed. But if you don't have that first inkling from the heart to hear it and to kind of let the Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim wash over you and into you, it's really impossible then to digress and dissect the rest of it and say, oh yeah, well this is, of course, what Islam is all about, and this is why you have these 14 chapters, and you've got this book, and you've got this challenge to make it part of your life.
Right. And in a funny way, it makes me think of connections with the Jewish tradition that, I don't know if this is the case for you, but whenever I teach about Judaism, the students, again, most of our students at Loyola Marymount University are Christian. Half of them are Catholic, 78% of them are Christian. When you talk about Judaism, sometimes there's this sense that Judaism is this hidebound tradition, that it's legalistic, and you want to say, you learn more about Judaism. I learned more about Judaism going to a Jewish friend's home for the Sabbath for one evening than in reading half a dozen books on Judaism. That it's that experience, how is this religious tradition lived out? And you've got a tremendous amount of experience in doing that because you've traveled extensively through the Muslim world. And I think, again, that's one of the things that really comes through in the book, the Quran, a biography, is that how is the Quran understood in this location or in that location?
Yeah. Well, actually, it's interesting you say travel because one of the people who picked up the book and really didn't like it was my local rabbi. I'm not Jewish, but I mean a person whom I know because he's a very friendly and engaged guy, and he's a local rabbi. And he said, I really had problems with your book. Can we go and have lunch and talk about it? So I go there. I said, what was the chapter you had problems with? And he said, the Dome of the Rock. He said, I've always thought that was Jewish territory, and you're saying that it's really claimed for Islam, and the Quran is there. He said, oh my God. He said, it makes all the controversy about the Temple of the Mount much greater. I said, you're right. I mean, because Islam came after Judaism, it came after Christianity, and I said, this is one of the places where initially it was the Qibla, the orientation for prayer, but then it has this importance for the ascension. I told him again about the ascension. He said, oh yeah, I remember reading about that. He said, but you don't really think that happened. I said, no, listen, what I think is that it's not my place to decide whether it happened or not. What is important is that it's a landmark. It's one of the major defining moments of the Prophet Muhammad's career is the Mi'raj, is the Isra and then the Mi'raj. And I said, to the extent that one enters into Islam and tries to understand the Quran from a Muslim perspective, you have to appreciate this part of it. So we had a lovely lunch, and at the end of it he said, this really helps me. He said, I'm going to have a lot of Jewish friends that are really unhappy when I tell them that, we ought to just move on to other issues, that's Muslim territory. But he said, when it comes up to Rosh Hashanah, I want you to come to the synagogue. I said, why? He says, it's the beginning of Ramadan this year. Oh, I said, that's right, they coincide this year. I said, but I'm not a Muslim. Why do you want me to come? Well, he says, clear that you have a lot of sympathies with a Muslim perspective. And he said, I have this Mishnah, this kind of commentary on the Hebrew Bible, which talks about the sacrifice of Isaac. I said, I'm not going there. I know what you're going to say. Our guys say it's Isaac, and the Muslims say it's Ishmael, and you want me to defend. He says, no, I said, I want you to do the opposite. He said, I've got this particular commentary, this Jewish commentary, that says it could have been Ishmael. Really? And he said, yeah. And he said, I want you to give me an Arabic one that talks about Isaac. So I did give him Tabari.
Sure.
Because Tabari says, there's two different ways of thinking about it, but it probably was Ishaq. This is, one of the great mufassirun of all Quran scholarship. So I go there, go into this synagogue. Here's this guy, a rabbi, who, 1 week earlier wasn't really willing to think about the Haram Sharif as Muslim territory. We talk, and he pulls out this thing which says, God appears to Abraham, and he says, sacrifice thy beloved son. To which Abraham's response is, I got two sons. Well, says the Almighty, your beloved son, I love them both. Isaac and Ishmael, I love them both. Hesitation. Okay, in that case, Isaac.
Professor Lawrence, you talked about speaking to high school teachers, and I had this wonderful experience earlier this year of going to a private school in California at a high school and teaching to a grade 11 English class about religion. And I thought that was so powerful that this high school teacher realized that in a literature class, he needed to discuss with his students so they could discover the literature of the world, meaning the world's religions. And I think that's so important because what I see, not just at the institution where I teach, but other institutions, students come in woefully unprepared to learn about religion because they don't know the stories, they don't know the Bible, they don't know the Quran. I'm intrigued by your working with high school teachers. What were the things that they came away with in terms of learning about the Quran?
Yeah, it's actually interesting that the whole title of this program was Overcoming Religious Illiteracy. And so the notion that there actually is religious illiteracy, the same way there's mathematical illiteracy or literary illiteracy, how do you confront it? And so this particular professor from Harvard Divinity, Diane Moore, is really intent on it. And one of the examples she gives is trying to teach a course in Islamic cultural studies. She calls it Islamic cultural studies. And she said until yesterday she hadn't realized how the Quran and really understand the Quran fed into all the other aspects of what she was trying to do in making Islam more accessible and making it also an equivalent experience for her Jewish, Christian, but also pagan students. It was interesting. She mentioned students, pagan may be too strong a word, but they come from a family where there's simply no religious education, what we would call secular, maybe secular is better than pagan, but a family where there's no attention to religion, which happens in the United States. And she found that when they were introduced sort of gradually to Islam, they understood some features, but they kept coming back to the arcana as if Islam was defined by the 5 pillars. But she said the Quran is much more interesting than sort of a dogmatic thing like, oh, here's the 5 pillars, this is the ABCDs of Islam. Because she said there's so many aspects of it as not only a revealed text, but also an aesthetically appreciated text, as also a lived experience, as also something which for many people defines the possibilities as well as the everyday experience of their lives. So she was really taken with this, and her takeaway, or she said they always had at the end of this, what do you get from it? The takeaway she had is that the Quran is a book, but more than a book.
Thank you for that, Professor Lawrence. Thank you for watching Perspectives on Faith on Ebru TV. We'll be right back in a few minutes after this break with more from Professor Bruce Lawrence. Welcome back to Perspectives on Faith on Ebru TV. I'm your host, Dr. Amir Hussain. I teach at Loyola Marymount University. With us today is our guest, Dr. Bruce Lawrence, who is the director of the Islamic Studies Center at Duke University and the author of this new book, The Quran, a Biography. Dr. Lawrence, before we start talking a little bit more about your book, could you tell us about your mentor? You talked about Franz Rosenthal, who you had the privilege of working with at Yale. Could you tell us a little bit about who he was and the kind of work that he did and how that inspired you to do the work that you do?
Yeah, Professor Rosenthal, like the giant whom you know from your past, Professor Wilfred Cantwell Smith, both Professor Smith and Professor Rosenthal share this sense of being very old school, coming from traditions of a certain notion about academic protocol where the teacher is very much the teacher and the student is always submissive. If everyone is a Muslim, then students before teacher are doubly Muslim. They are submissive not only to the framework of the divine, but also to the inspiration and direction of their teacher. So in my case, Professor Rosenthal was very insistent that I do intensive work between 2 religious traditions. And he thought, you have a mind where you're able to explore many cultural possibilities, so you should look at the interrelation between Islam and the Indian world. And that's why when I was a grad student, I worked on Shahrastani, Abu Fadl Abdul Karim al-Shahrastani's Kitab al-Milal wal-Nihl. And that was sort of an inspiration for me to sort of use texts, but to go beyond them in thinking about cultural parallels and cross-cultural understandings. And Professor Rosenthal said, one of the things you must never neglect is to read texts and reread them. And I think that's a lesson that really has paid off for me with the Quran is, as anybody knows, it's not a text you simply hear or read once. Every time that you hear it or read it, you should be prepared for something new. It's not to say that it's going to be completely new, but the levels of understanding and the levels perhaps of insight change over time. So the book is the same, the words are the same, but you're not the same.
Exactly, and the things that you bring as the reader change every time. Can you tell us a little bit about the structure of your new book, The Quran, a Biography, and the things that you cover in that book?
So I'm very happy, Amir, that I was not asked to do this book when I was 40 or 50, but in fact when I had just turned 60, because I had already been teaching for over 30 years and thought a lot about the many complexities and rivulets that aren't readily available or visible in thinking about the Muslim world. So at first I resisted and said, I'm not the one to do this book. And I gave several names of alternative authors to the publisher. The publisher kept coming back to me and saying, no, but you've done this and you've done that, and we'd like to have the kind of perspective that's not a specialist, someone who's engaged in the overall understanding of the Muslim world, but not a specialist on the Quran. So I said, well then, what do you want from me? He said, well, just do your understanding of how Muhammad became a prophet. I said, oh, but everybody's written about that. No, you do your take. So in trying to write about the prophet, I mean, I've read Sirah of Ibn Ishaq, and I have thought about Ibn Khaldun again. Ibn Khaldun's wonderfully engaged way of talking about the Prophet Muhammad as someone who was part of his time, but also apart from his time because of his experience of Tawheed, which became the source for revelation. And the wonderful relationship that Ibn Khaldun describes between naql and aql, between what you receive and then how you reflect on it through your God-given intellect. So I'd had a lot of experience with this, but never honed it and never focused it on simply the Quran. So it was extremely tough to tell the story of the Prophet Muhammad. And of course, one of the benefits you have is you have the hijrah, so you can tell the story in two parts. And you begin with a part about the merchant and messenger, and then you can move to the messenger who also becomes a statesman. And so the part on the Prophet Muhammad's the longest, and then I went all the way through to the end and finally ended with talking about Indonesia and Indonesian healers who use the Quran for AIDS patients. So from the Prophet Muhammad to Indonesian healers, everything in between in an intervening 1400-year period. And when I sort of done it, it took me 3 years. I was walking with my wife one day and she said, this book is really good. It may be the best book that you've written, but it's defective. I said, well, of course, I'm defective. No, she said, it's really defective. I said, what?
Did she elaborate?
She said, there's no woman. I said, yes, I mentioned a lot about Khadija. I talk a lot about the importance of Fatima. I talk a lot about, I have a whole chapter in Jafar as-Sadiq where I talk about how this genealogy that goes through women is really important. She says, no, there's no central woman. Oh, I talk about the Taj Mahal. There's a dead woman there. I mean, you wouldn't have the Taj Mahal if there wasn't
for a woman.
A woman. Not enough. I said, but I have a healer at the end. She's an anonymous woman. She's a healer who uses the Quran. Not enough. Well, who am I going to get? She says, there's one person you've ignored. Who's that? Aisha. Aisha. And it suddenly came to me, of course, Aisha. I kind of looked through and beyond the life of the Prophet Muhammad. I thought after he died, move on to the companions, the successors and the companions. And then I went back and really worked on Aisha and thought about her as a custodian, not only of the Prophet's memory, but also of the Quran.
Quran, absolutely.
And I began to find all kinds of things about Aisha I'd never read before. I always thought of her as just sort of that brash, red-headed woman who got into trouble with all of Muhammad's companions. But in fact, she's a really complex, interesting figure. And in one sense, she's the bridge, in my view, and I say it in the book, between the Quran and the Sunnah. Because she makes this wonderful statement at one point that the Quran was revealed to the Prophet Muhammad, but he was the walking Quran. He was the walking Quran. And that's a remarkable image. And to think about how then you've got the text, or as it were, all the different revelations that became a text, but then you have the life of the Prophet, which is the walking Quran that becomes the Sunnah. So in one sense, that was the breakthrough for me, when I had this walk, so to speak, and my wife and I, discussed the book, and then I went back and it took me a whole other year to really get it right. I don't know I did it perfectly right, but to really capture something of the flavor of Aisha, and to put that as the third chapter that then moves on to the rest.
That's one of my favorite chapters in the book, and I want to thank your wife for suggesting that you work on that. But it goes back to what we were talking about. I mean, those of us that have been privileged to have such wonderful teachers are able to carry their memory to another generation of students, so that you who worked with Professor Rosenthal, and he did his work a significant amount of time ago can still pass that information on to your current generation of students who were born long after Professor Rosenthal passed away, in the same way that I can do that with Professor Smith. And so for me, there's a connection with Aisha for that reason, that here's someone who's young but can pass on not just the memory of the Prophet, but the actual interactions with the Prophet to a whole other generation of people. And then the point of one of the early copies of the Quran being given to Hafsa. You know, we don't see that in other traditions necessarily. What does it mean that a copy of the sacred scripture is given to a woman? There's no issue that somehow women are impure, somehow women can't receive, somehow women can't read the scripture, that this text is given to a woman. And I think that's so important.
It's really important. And then when you begin to think about it, and you think about, the recurrent force of the basmala, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, and even when you're writing about men, and I do have some significant chapters on Ibn Arabi and Jalaluddin Rumi, you realize that, as it were, the feminine voice, or the kind of softer way of thinking about life. Rumi's wonderful statement where he says, you must submit to the tyranny of women because through them you beat your own nafs, your own lower self. And so, you know, you read that again and you say, well, yes, but then there also is that other thing that women inform you about, how the greatest capacities that you have are inside yourself and not simply in your first desires or your most apparent needs. So in a way, the Aisha chapter kind of, I think, pushed it to another limit. And to get back to the teachers yesterday, many of them were women, and they didn't, like you, refer to the Aisha chapter, but many of them said, you know why we like this book? Is it's written from the heart. I said, well, I actually spent a lot of time at my desk, you know, working on a PC. But actually, I was thinking, but I was also feeling something of this greatness of, as you say, the privilege of having had a great teacher, wonderful, wonderful instructor and example in Professor Rosenthal. But then doing a book that, were he alive, he died, of course, 4 years ago, I think he would have said, it's okay, but Mr. Lawrence, next edition, use footnotes.
As a consummate scholar, there. Were there things that you learned about the Quran in terms of doing this? Were there things that surprised you as you came to write the book, something that you might not have thought about before?
Well, I got two things that actually surprised me on both ends. One of the things that really surprised me is a number of people, I'm really pleased that you like the Aisha chapter, and I think that's one of my favorites. But the number of people like chapter 7, which is on Robert of Ketton. And Robert of Ketton, as you know, was a monk, a Catholic monk, who was fluent in Latin and Arabic and translated a lot of Arabic text into Latin in Toledo, and then was given a command by Peter the Venerable just at the cusp when the Crusades were happening in the 12th, 13th century, to do a translation of the Quran. And so many people have said, oh, you know, this is a terrible book. It's, you know, he's taken liberty with the Quran. He calls Muhammad a liar, and calls the Quran a book of lies. You know, sounded almost like Pope Benedict. And then, you know, you read it as I did it, and you see that the cover he gives is, oh yes, of course Islam is a false religion, of course this is a book of lies. But then the actual translations, some parts are very not only generous, but expressive. And you kind of feel that in one way he was trying to say, as I quoted in there, that if you have an enemy, you don't fight him with a sword, you fight him with a word. You don't try and kill him, you try to understand him. And I think that's the kind of Cistercian, as opposed to some other Christian forms of interaction, that he represents. And so Robert of Ketton is, in a sense, a very strong and important chapter in that book. But this woman yesterday, one of the women in the teacher session, said that not only did she find this as a book from the heart, but she really came away with a new appreciation for the names of God. And I said, wow, how did you get, I mean, for me, it's a central part of my life is the Asma'ul al-Husna, the beautiful names, and the fact that it doesn't compromise Tawheed, the oneness of God, but it gives it so many flavors. And so she said, I thought the Ibn Arabi chapter was a little dry, because Ibn Arabi talks about how each person appropriates a name, a divine name, and that becomes sort of the way in which he or her experiences the divine. But she said she really liked the Rumi chapter, because she said there was a sense in which, you know, Rumi seemed to experience God as constant motion, constant motion. And that for her was the prelude to the Taj Mahal. She said the Taj Mahal was just a whole opening, because the one thing that is true about the Taj Mahal is not simply a tribute to Ibn Arabi, but it's using that notion of the divine names as they applied to Mumtaz Mahal. So it's kind of like, one person described it as like it's a replica of paradise, as one might imagine paradise in a Muslim worldview, replicated on earth, that makes the Taj Mahal this sort of ground plan, if you will, of the divine beauty. But then inside, each part of it, right down to the crypt at the very bottom, reflects the Asma al-Husna that are around the lattice of the tomb of Mumtaz Mahal. So she said she thought that was so wonderful, because it's not all of the Asma al-Husna. I mean, there are 99. So which ones were selected, and how were they framed? And I talk about that in there. And she said, you know, it made her want to get in a plane and go to India.
Yeah. And it's such a magnificent structure to see that building and to understand the love that comes from that. And that's one of those misconceptions, I think, that many non-Muslims have about Islam, that somehow there's no beauty there, somehow there's no love there. And all the traditions, whether we call it ishq or khub or wadda, you know, about that in the Quran. And that comes through with regard to your book. And it was really interesting to hear people say that it comes to the heart. I mean, I have the great pleasure of having known you for several years, and so I know that this is something that you're very passionate about. And for me, that's so extraordinary that here you are, as someone who's studied this text for so long, isn't a Muslim, this isn't a religious text for you, but that you appreciate how, for Muslims, it's this deeply, deeply important text.
Well, actually, I think I want to correct you in one sense, say that you're right about I'm not a Muslim with a capital M, but it is a kind of religious text for me in a way that comes out, and I just want to make it clear how it comes out. I don't think I would have been engaged with the Quran to the extent I am had I only had the wonderful direction of Professor Rosenthal. I also had an experience in the late 80s when I was in Amman, Jordan, of meeting this Palestinian scholar named Ibrahim Abu Nab. Ibrahim Abu Nab, unfortunately, has died, but he, in the 80s, welcomed me into his home. He saw that I was somebody who was immersed in Islam and really engaged with the messages of the Quran. So he said, let's read it together. And I said, why? He said, well, he said, there are parts of it I don't understand. I said, how's that? I said, you're not only a scholar of Islam, he's, by the way, a PhD in English literature from Indiana University. I said, God, you've read Trollope and you've read the Quran. How could you not understand? He said, there are levels within it that I will never understand. And so we sat down and we started one night. It was around 8 o'clock, and we went till 4. 8 hours. It was like this interview,
it seemed like nothing.
only even faster. And at the end of it, we had only read 2 surahs of the entire Quran. So he said, are you up for another night? And I said, another night? He said, oh yeah. He said, there are a lot more. And we finally came around to Surah Al-Zilzala, the chapter on the earthquake. And we went through it. And he said at the end, he said, you're now a custodian of Surah Al-Zilzala. I said, how can I be a custodian? He said, my grand project is that the Quran should open up to the world through surahs and particular individual understandings of those surahs. And he said, I have this dream that this will not be a book for Muslims only, but for all of humankind, as it was intended, that all humankind would benefit from this book. And he said, so I want to make you a custodian of Surah Al-Zilzala. And I must say, in my own devotions every day, that's still there.
That comes in. That's so powerful. You know, for me, as someone who's a Canadian who moved to Los Angeles a decade ago, earthquakes are a very different phenomenon for me now, because you experience them in Los Angeles. And so for me, it's really amazing to hear you say that, because that's the one chapter in the Quran that's had, of course, much more meaning for me now to say, so what's this like now that you've experienced earthquakes? What about the earthquake, capital T, capital E, when everything that's inside of her, the earth, will be revealed, will be brought forth? Really powerful. And thank you for talking about how this is a religious text for you, because again, for me, as someone who is a Muslim, you get inspired by other texts, particularly, in my case, the Gospels. And I wish more Christians would read the Gospels. I wish more Muslims would read the Gospels in the heart of that message. But the fact that you learn different things. I was in Cincinnati last week, doing some things on Catholic-Muslim dialogue with a Catholic priest, Elias Mallon. And I learned some things from him about a chapter in Mark's Gospel that I'd never learned before. And you appreciate that in exactly the same way that you learn to appreciate something in the Quran from reading it with a Muslim scholar of the text.
I just want to tell you two things. That many people don't, when they read a book, don't look at the dedication. But I dedicate this to Dr. Ibrahim Abu-Nab because he gave me such a depth of appreciation for the Quran that I don't think I ever would have had without him as the emissary of that. But at the end of the Surah Al-Zilzalah, when you talk about all these transformative events that happen, at the end of it, it comes down with a simple message. وَمَنْ يَعْمَلْ مِثْقَالَ ذَرَّةٍ خَيْرًا يَرَى وَمَنْ يَعْمَلْ مِثْقَالَ ذَرَّةٍ شَرًّا يَرَى. So whoever does even one iota of good, one little atom of good, will see it on the Day of Judgment. When the Malika Yawm Ad-Din announces judgment. And whoever just does that either one iota of evil will see it. You can't hide. There's nowhere to go. God sees it.
And that's all of us, because all of us have done, even the worst person has done one little thing that's good. Even the best person has done one little thing that they're ashamed of. And so all of us contain that.
But it's that beautiful way of the macrocosm in our language. Macrocosm, what could be more fantastic than Judgment Day? I mean, the whole show is over, and the whole show is on. And then it comes down to one little iota of this and one little iota of that. It's the ultimate resonation of qabs and bust. Bust, is expansion, God beyond the whole universe, and qabs at the base of your heart. And so I found that that's why the Surah Al-Zilzalah for me is just not simply a text, it's also very much a spiritual source.
And that's so important there. Another thing, I mean, there's two very different ways that I like the book, and one of them is the sense of the history of the interpretation of the text. And this goes back, you had mentioned my great teacher, Wilfred Cantwell Smith. His last book was a book called What is Scripture? A Comparative Approach. And he talks about the importance of Quran commentary, that this isn't just a text that was meant to give instruction in the 7th century, or the 8th century, or the 9th century, or the 15th century, or the 21st century, but in all of those. And so that you look at the Quran over time, but that you also look at the Quran over space in terms of the geography.
Oh, that's nice.
That how is it that Muslims in your love has been South Asia, in South Asia look at the text, or how do Muslims in Arabia look at the text, or how do Muslims in Indonesia look at the text, in that
or Muslims
sense,
in African America look at it.
In America, which of course is who we are here in America. If we look at who American Muslims are, by most studies, a third of us are South Asian, a third of us are Middle Eastern, at least 25% of us are African American. And so in this context, we've got African American Muslims looking at the text, or Turkish Muslims looking at the text, or Pakistani Muslims looking at the text in an American context. And that's so rich in the book.
Well, I didn't write this as a kind of tribute to American Islam or American Muslims. But I think by bringing up W.D. Muhammad and bringing up, for instance, Sister Deborah Majid, who I mentioned to you is one of my favorite people, and is a convert to Islam in her adult life. She was not. She was born and raised. In fact, she was ordained a Methodist minister, and then became a Muslim. And now she's a Muslim da'i, or preacher. She's great. But Sister Deborah said to me when she read that chapter, she said, I realized, that God gave you a gift that some of us Muslims didn't have, and that is to see ourselves in the mirror of God. And that to me, if that happens, whether a person is Muslim or not, if they can see something of the mirror of the divine through that book, then I think I've done it. Then, maybe I should stop writing. But I have to tell you one thing funny. The chapter that has been quoted most often in some places in England is a chapter on Ja'far as-Sadiq. Because the only chapter in there on quote-unquote a Shiite. It's of course the Shiite Imam, not just a Mufassir. And many people said, oh, but he was just the beginning. There are all these others, Tabulsi, there's all these other, Tadi, all these other commentators from the Shiite tradition. Why don't you do a second book on the Shi'i views of the Quran? And I kind of hesitate. I mean, one part of me says, oh, it'd be really interesting, but another part of me says it would destroy the purpose of this one, which is an inclusive vision. I'm not saying that I couldn't have benefited if I had 250 pages of doing a couple more chapters on Shia. I could have easily done more chapters on Sunni commentators. I mean, Tabari doesn't stand for everybody. But my sense is that it's better to have an accent instead of an encyclopedia.
Absolutely.
And so that's what this book is.
Absolutely. And you really do a wonderful job of being able to illustrate the differences in ways in which Muslims have done it, at the same time talking about their commonalities as Muslims, because the real danger becomes, well, these people aren't really Muslims, or those people really aren't Muslims, or the Shias have a different text, and of course they don't. You know, we all read the same Quran. How we understand it, how we interpret it, whether we're Muslim or not, whether we're Sunni Muslim, Shia Muslim, it's really important to talk about, you know, that shared vision. And that's the real danger, just in any conservative fundamentalist kind of reading of the text, that you pick and choose. We talk about the term proof texting. It's very easy, if we're talking about the Quran or the Torah or the New Testament, to pick a verse totally out of context and say, see, we can do this because it says that. And you forget that later on, maybe even in the same chapter, it says the exact opposite. You know, how do you read this as an integrated whole? And that becomes the crucial thing. How do you connect that with all the traveling that you've done? I mean, you've been so privileged to spend time in very different parts of the Muslim world. Did you get a sense of, you know, where the Quran fits into life, let's say in South Asia or Indonesia or the Arab world? And would you talk a little bit about some of those kinds of things, you know, how that Quran is experienced in your travels?
Yeah. I do it inter alia. I do it sort of between the lines here without saying, oh, now I'm in Indonesia, now I'm in Morocco, and now I'm somewhere in Saudi Arabia. But I have been privileged, very privileged, to have a spouse. I mentioned Miriam before. I should mention her by name. My wife is Dr. Miriam Cook, professor of Arabic and modern Arabic literature.
Also at Duke University.
And also Duke University. And what Miriam has shared with me is this enthusiasm for travel. So I don't need to always travel alone or with only one bag. I can sometimes carry two, and it's hers. But what we've done when we traveled, as we went out to Indonesia, I was the scholar. I was supposed to be the senior professor at the major Islamic university in Jakarta. And we showed up. The women said, oh, but your wife is also a professor. Can she give a course? And I said, in what? And they said, in Arabic. There's a course on the books in modern Arabic. It's never been taught. So Miriam, my wife, taught a course in modern Arabic in the leading Islamic university in Jakarta without pay and without preparation. And she had a wonderful experience, and she actually maybe had almost as good an experience with her students, Indonesian students in Arabic, as I had with my Indonesian students in English. But it was the same university, and it was the same period of time in the spring of '06. And of course, when you asked me about using the Quran, Amin Rais, the head of the Muhammadiyah, marked it when he said, the Danish cartoon crisis came up, and he said, if you read the Quran and you read this Danish cartoon, you have only one reaction. You say, this is not representative of the Prophet Muhammad, and then you shut up. Because if you can't convince them once, you're not going to win them twice. And I thought that was just a marvelous, talk about tasamuh, tolerance. That was a wonderful Quranic emblem of tolerance in the form of arguably one of the most powerful religious leaders in Indonesia, Amin Rais, also educated in America at the University of Chicago. And Amin Rais said, yes, you stand up for your faith. That's the Indonesian way, and that's the Quranic message. But no, you do not attack and be violent in the name of Allah.
Dr. Lawrence, I wanted to thank you so much for the privilege of being on this program with you. Thank you for watching Perspectives on Faith on Ebru TV. Our guest today has been Dr. Bruce Lawrence from Duke University, who's written this magnificent book, The Quran, a Biography. For Perspectives on Faith, I'm your host, Amir Hussain.